The OA was a Netflix original series that was intended to have 5 seasons, but was cancelled after only 2. So today I'm going to talk about how the series would have gone in its 3rd, 4th, and 5th seasons if it hadn't been cancelled. While some fans may think this is impossible for us to know, the creators have said through the show that this is something we are capable of doing. Through the character of Fola and her commentary on the house on Nob Hill in Season 2, they explain that the show is not a war, but a puzzle, something the creators want us to be able to solve. Season 1 followed Prairie Johnson, calling herself the OA, as she returned to her adoptive parents' hometown after being missing for 7 years. She tells the story of her supposed kidnapping to 4 high school students and their teacher, explaining how a mad scientist held her and several others as prisoners in his basement, forcing them to have near-death experiences and using his technology to map out the audio of what they experienced in those moments where they were dead, giving him a recording of what they experienced on the other side. These captives of HAP, or haptives, use the NDEs, during which they would go to strange other places, in order to gather 5 movements that will help them open a portal to escape. After getting the 5th movement, Hap abandons Prairie, claiming he'll take the other haptives to another dimension where she can't reach them. Prairie thus must teach the movements to the Crestwood 5, so that in the season finale, they could open a portal to wherever Homer has been taken. The entire season was forcing us to ask the same question the Crestwood 5 was asking, which was whether or not Prairie's story was true, and in Season 2, it appeared it was. In Season 2, Prairie finds herself in the body of a version of herself that never moved to America as a kid, and where Homer works for Hap as a psychiatrist in a mental health facility holding Scott, Rachel, and Renata as patients, now all prisoners of Hap, who claims their shared memories of their previous dimension are just delusions. This season followed Prairie unraveling the nature of the multiverse, which is presented as a never-ending series of alternate timelines branching off from the same source. The end of the season, however, had the characters jumping into a 3rd dimension that would have been explored in Season 3, one where the OA is just a Netflix TV series being filmed in London, created by Britt Marling, who is both the creator of the OA in real life alongside Zalbat Manglish, in addition to playing the character of the OA herself. While the show only got 2 seasons, it gave us a great glimpse of what the 3rd season would be, and with clues from the show and the writers themselves, most of the story of the OA can be filled in with what we already know. The creators have said the show is meant to have 5 seasons in various interviews, with 5 being an important number in the show's mythology, and there being a consistent theme of 4 becoming 5. This is something we see in Season 1, with the 4 haptives becoming 5 when Renata joins them, the Crestwood students becoming 5 when BB-8 joins them, and Prairie having 1 larger doll looking over 4 smaller dolls in her bedroom. All of this emphasizes not just that there will be 5 seasons, but that there will be something about the 5th season that sets it apart from the others. In addition to the number 5, there is also a lot of symbolism in the show that indicates that the story is both a loop and a palindrome. This is evidenced by the theme song for the series itself, which when played in reverse is still the same song, just with a different tonal shift from the beginning to the end, making it a musical palindrome. Even more evidence for this comes from the title of the show itself, The OA. The O represents the infinite loop that the OA is trapped in, which is the 5-season cycle that loops back to the beginning at its very end. The A in the OA represents how the first half of the story will mirror the second half, with there being a breaking open point in the very middle as seen in the stylization of the logo. Britt Marling has said in interviews that she wanted to experiment with a storytelling structure that may be more relatable to women, creating a pattern of repetitions and loops modeled after women's menstrual cycles and sexual experiences. The inspiration for this pattern is something that can also be found in the works of Madame Blavatsky, particularly her 2-part series, The Secret Doctrine. Madame Blavatsky was a famous psychic and esotericist from the 1800s who claimed to have access to an ancient Tibetan document that is the source of all the various myths in the world. In her 2-part book series, she deconstructs this supposed document by comparing it to the various known myths around the world, creating a supposed common story that they all share. In these books, Blavatsky describes existence itself as being a loop and a palindrome, with humans as a species just reaching the halfway point of their existence, following which they will begin to return to where they came from, closer to nature and God, but coming back to God with all the information we have gained by walking away from him thus far. The Secret Doctrine was a powerful influence on the OA, and while the actual Secret Doctrine itself is clearly fake, it was used to explain some very real truths about the various myths of the world. The OA as a show does this as well, with a fictional narrative that tries to construct a worldview that explains modern science as well as ancient myth. And as such, these are two books that we will be discussing quite a bit as we figure out what's going on in Seasons 3, 4, and 5 of the OA. With all of this in mind, Season 1 and 2 were meant to build into an epic breaking open point in the very middle of the series, which would have been Season 3. From there, the story would have descended back in the direction it started, with Season 4 being a reflection of Season 2. However, Season 5 would not be a fifth and final dimension, but rather would return us back to Dimension 1, further back in time. Season 1 of the OA of course had two stories within it, the one in the present in Crestwood, and the other the story that the OA is telling to the Crestwood 5 about her life leading up to the first episode. I believe Season 5 will involve the OA traveling back in time to the beginning of this cycle, through which we would see the true version of her time with Hap and understand why the OA may have lied about some parts of her story. The greatest evidence for this comes from the house on Nob Hill in Season 2, which itself is a metaphor for the show. By going through the puzzles of the house, Kareem learns to think esoterically, looking for hidden patterns and clues so that by the time he makes it to the end of the house, he can understand the final clue. A quote from T.S. Eliot which says, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." This teaches Kareem to go back to the secret entrance of the house, the place where he started. When the flooding waters came in, he and the OA tried to escape by going upward, not realizing that there was another entrance that Kareem could now swim to that leads him directly to the attic. This was to teach us, the viewers, that the show is a series of puzzles meant to give us the tools we need so that when we make it to the end, we will be able to go back to the beginning of the story and see the true version of it and understand it in a way that wouldn't have made sense if they just gave it to us in Season 1. The point of the series was to give us a question at the end of Season 1. Was the OA lying? When we got to Season 2, it appeared that the OA had told the truth about everything, but by the time we loop back to Season 5, we will have the knowledge necessary to understand what really happened and why we couldn't understand the truth yet. With all of that in mind, here is the story of Seasons 3, 4, and 5, beginning of course with Season 3. Dimensions 1 and 2 were presented as splits in a timeline, but in Dimension 3, both would appear to be just fictional stories that Dimension 3's Britt Marling wrote when creating the series The OA. This dimension has been foreshadowed throughout the show. Each of the haptives sees a glimpse of a future dimension, such as how in Season 1 we saw a glimpse of Season 2 through Homer's NDE in Episode 4. In Season 2, we don't get to see what Scott saw in Dimension 3, but he does explain some of the details of his NDE to Dr. Roberts. Here, he says that there were all these cameras around, and that they weren't calling the OA by any of her known names, but rather Bryn something, a misheard Britt Marling. Elodie has described this dimension to the OA, saying she went to a dimension where she was an actress and saw all the scenes of her various lives played out on screen. At the time, most fans assumed this to just be another split in the timeline where Elodie happened to become an actress, but instead, it was that a fictional version of Elodie had made it to the real world of Dimension 3 where her previous lives were just fictional TV shows or movies. OA jumped to this dimension hoping to save Homer, who was about to die in Dimension 2, and together they would make it to the third dimension along with Hap. Hap of course jumped into the body of the actor Jason Isaacs, the actor who plays him, and who in this world is married to Britt Marling, as well as co-creator of the OA series, taking the place of Britt Marling's real-life best friend and co-creator Zal Batmanglij. The story of Season 3 would likely have two parts, the first being about the OA with her amnesia, and the second half being about her journey once she gets her memories back. The first half of the season would follow her thinking she really is just Britt Marling. As Hap warned, everyone here would call her the OA, as that's the TV show she stars in, but she wouldn't call herself that. Most people on the street wouldn't know the name of the actress who created the show and starred in it, and instead would just ask her, "Are you the OA?" And she would politely constantly be explaining that she is Britt Marling, star and creator of the OA. Memory loss is a common part of jumping dimensions, but for OA, any memories that she might retain would be written off as fantasies of Dimension 3 Britt Marling during her development for the show. The OA would likely want to believe what happened to her, but everyone, particularly her husband Jason Isaacs, would be telling her that that is crazy thinking. After recovering from her injury, Britt Marling and Jason Isaacs would resume their work on the show, with Jason Isaacs, controlled by Hap, trying to rewrite the show to make it more about him and glorifying his position in the balance of the story. Along the way, Homer and Steve would be trying to convince the OA of who she really is. Steve, not having the OA he remembers to guide him, would have a really hard time dealing with his jump to Dimension 3. Homer will presumably retain his memories and will have to come and find OA as he promised in the Season 2 finale, and as such, Homer will likely become a guide to Steve this season. Both would be able to fill in the parts of the story that the other had missed, and Homer would teach Steve that it can take a while for someone's memories to return, such as his did, but if that they are patient enough, they can rescue her from Hap. As the third season, it is in the very middle of the series, which we discussed before as being an important breaking open moment before the story begins to descend back to where it started. To foreshadow this, each season has a breaking open moment halfway through the story at the end of episode 4 for season 1 and 2, which are each 8 episodes long. This breaking open point is given to us as an NDE, which gives us a glimpse of the season to come. For Homer, it was his vision we discussed before of Dimension 2's psych ward. After being drowned by Hap, he traveled to another dimension through some vents, and his consciousness seemingly fell into the body of a patient at the Treasure Island facility. We know that Homer didn't enter his own body in Dimension 2, as we can see in Season 2 that Homer is with the OA at the moment that Dimension 1 Homer is supposedly crawling through the vents, and Dr. Roberts is later called to help calm down the patient that Dimension 1 Homer had taken possession of. In Season 2, near the end of Episode 4, Old Night killed OA for about 30 seconds so she could travel to Dimension 3 and see what Old Night called the moment where she sees her true face and reawakens to her mission. Now, Dimension 3 is presented as the most realistic of the worlds, as it's supposed to resemble our own, so I'm not sure if the midway point of Season 3 will give us a flash forward of Season 4 the way Seasons 1 and 2 did. Instead, I believe that the moment Old Night shows the OA is actually the moment that will be in the very middle of Season 3, the moment where she realizes she is not just Britt Marling, but that the story of the OA is true. When OA has her NDE in Season 2, she travels through some tunnels into an airplane bathroom. Presumably, she's in the body of a random person who is using that bathroom. As she leaves the bathroom, she approaches a figure that appears to be Dimension 3 Britt Marling from behind, as you can see with her short hair. Britt Marling turns to see who is approaching her, and of course, OA is revived by Kareem and brought back to Dimension 2. This moment would be really subtle in real life, but to Britt Marling, it would have huge significance. All season long, she would have been told that she is crazy, that these ideas that she is the OA are all wrong, and that she has no powers at all. But here, the OA would prove to herself that she was able to predict the future. By writing this flash forward into Season 2, the OA, in Season 3, would experience it and realize that she had predicted this moment coming true, and that it would be the moment where she realized who she really is to return to her mission. Until now, the dimensions were seen as splits in the same timeline, but here the OA would realize that Britt Marling is a higher being of sorts, one who created Dimensions 1 and 2 as part of her fantasies and gave them the tools to jump out of their dimension and into her reality, into the bodies of the people who inspired them, the actors who played them in the show. This was done not just through Britt Marling's fantasy, but through the power of belief she harnessed from her audience, using them to make her fantasy accidentally become reality. This was something the entire show was built upon, as even back in Season 1, it is the same logic that works with the movements. The first time the movements are done in the cafeteria, they do not appear to actually work. The OA is shot by a gun, but she doesn't immediately die or travel to Dimension 2 after the movements. Instead, she lives long enough for an ambulance to get to her and take her away, and it's not until she begins to leave that Steve can hear her begin to travel. Instead, the OA's natural death made her ascend to another dimension, something it did every other time that she had a near-death experience. This time, however, because she believed the movements had worked, she was able to will herself to Homer, which according to the sheriff's wife Evelyn in Season 1, will is what it takes to swim to the other side, something the OA already had. Because the Crestwood Five had never done the movements before, they couldn't really believe in them enough to actually work in Season 1. But because OA died and made it to the other dimension and sent Rachel back as proof, the Crestwood Five began to believe that their movements themselves had actually opened the Invisible River. This allows them in Season 2 to actually use the movements to help the OA. BBA says in the Season 2 finale that they need to do the movements at that very moment in order to help the OA, but the robots are already performing these movements in Dimension 2. Now, Elodie was able to travel by making the robots do movements, but she is an integrated and experienced traveler who knows how to use emotional and sexual fuel properly to travel dimensions. She sees the movements as just one of many tools you can use for the process. Even with the interdimensional flowers that Hap has, I don't believe he had the proper fuel for the robots to work, and if they didn't work, Homer would have just died right there and then in Dimension 2. Therefore, it is actually the Crestwood 5 doing the movements that made it so OA could travel to Dimension 3, something that would put her in a new prison with Hap, but that she needed in order to stop Homer from dying right then and there. All of this was just part of the metaphysical foreshadowing of how reality works in the show, how all these tools are just innate powers each human has, but that requires a very real belief in them in order to work. And that is how Britt Marling in Dimension 3 would have brought the OA to life and given her the power and tools to jump into her body, allowing them to integrate into one being. With the OA, however, she would have created Hap, a much more evil character intent on wrecking reality and reshaping it in his image, something easier to do now that he would understand the influence he could have on many dimensions as a famous actor who has the power to get an audience and make them believe anything. This may even be the great evil that Katoon warned about in Season 1, a dark figure that would escape reality with the tools meant to help Prairie escape her prison. With that in mind, the OA would realize that she has to begin her journey back downward into a lower dimension, an attempt to stop Hap from damaging Dimension 3, and locking him in the memories of a character in what we will be calling Dimension 4 in Season 4. We got a really big preview of Season 3 at the very end of Season 2 when they showed us the new reality that OA was jumping into, giving us a solid foundation for the actual story of Season 3, but very little evidence exists in the show itself for what Season 4 would look like. Season 5 is theorized to take us back to the beginning, and that leaves Season 4 as a really big blank. However, with crossing the patterns of the seasons thus far, we can actually get a pretty good idea of how Season 4 would have gone. As a loop and a palindrome, Season 5 will loop back to Dimension 1, and thus the OA story would reach its technical end in Season 4, with Season 5 being a prequel that tells the true version of OA's story from Season 1. In addition to this, each season tends to have one character lose their memories. In Dimension 2, it was Homer. In Dimension 3, it was the OA. But in Dimension 4, the plan was for the OA and Homer to trap Hap, and thus he would lose his memories this time in the character that he takes over. Hap and OA are presented as polar opposites in Season 1, with OA being the most pure, and Hap being presented as the most evil in OA's story. Dimension 2 showed the native version of the OA, Nina, not as being evil, but not nearly as pure as Prairie was, making Prairie realize that she needed the evil Hap to keep crushing her to turn her into the angel that she is. Hap, meanwhile, takes over the body of Dr. Percy, someone still evil and an prisoner, but not as evil as his Dimension 1 self. In Dimension 3, the OA and Hap took over the bodies of Britt Marling and Jason Isaacs, who are married to each other. With Season 3 being the midpoint of the series, this would be where they are morally equal to each other, neither particularly good nor evil, but balanced people who bring balance to each other. Season 4 starts the decline back downward, and thus here, the OA would enter her most evil self so far, and Hap would enter his most good self, allowing him to lose sight of his evil thoughts. Here, the OA would have her memories, but have to play along with whatever role she has in the strange new dimension, as she doesn't want to make Hap remember who he really is. She would probably be someone really close to Hap, forcing her to maintain a life with him, forcing her to play nice to make sure Hap or his evil tendencies don't resurface. The OA would experience the darkest version of herself, being the prison guard to someone who had kept her prisoner, the roles now reversed. Perhaps the OA would even see Hap in a new light and begin to fall in love with him. Along the way, as Hap would slowly resurface, he would not just see how good he could be, but how he could have had the love of someone like the OA if he had just been that version of himself instead of the kind that tried to control someone else. This would allow the two of them to end the season with each having integrated with their 3 higher selves, each being 4-dimensional versions of themselves, becoming a 5th higher being, as foreshadowed throughout the series, with 4 becoming 5. Dimension 3 at this point is presented as the real world, with Dimensions 1 and 2 being fictional realities as part of a TV series, and thus Dimension 4, as a reflection of Dimension 2, would be another fictional world, one that is essentially a TV show or movie, which is interesting because thus far, the OA is actually a combination of the many works of Britt Marling and Zalbat Manglish, particularly all the works that they collaborated on. Season 1 of the OA is extremely similar to a film written by Zalbat Manglige and starring Brit Marling called The Sound of My Voice. In this film, Brit Marling tells her story to a group of people sitting on the floor in a room. In her story, she claims to be a time traveler, with the film ending on a note that looks like she may be telling the truth, but is not quite certain, just like in Season 1 with the Crestwood Five. Season 2 resembles Brit Marling's film Another Earth, which deals with the philosophical issues of seeing a version of yourself who didn't face the same sufferings and struggles that you did, with Brit Marling literally meeting a version of herself from another version of Earth that suddenly appeared in their sky one day, similar to how the OA had to integrate with Nina Azarova in Dimension 2 by taking over her body. Their other works deal with similar esoteric and spiritual concepts, such as eye origins dealing with reincarnations of humans being proven by the patterns in their eyes. Because of this, many fans believe that Season 4 will draw inspiration from the earliest collaboration of these two, the thesis film written and directed by Zalbat Manglige and starring Brit Marling, The Recordist. If you'd like to see the film before I discuss it, I will place a link in the description down below. Expect spoilers for the story ahead. The Recordist comes with the tagline, "What if you were here for a reason?" and follows Brit Marling as a student trying to get into a prestigious New York music program for which she needs to compose a beautiful song. She struggles to do this and acts out, partying and not being her best self, but the torture she puts herself through inspires her to compose great music. She meets a conspiracy theorist old woman who believes that Marling is one of many humans who are a recording device for aliens, due to a strange birthmark that Marling's character has. This is based off of a real-life conspiracy theory of people being abducted by aliens and supposedly coming back with the same strange marks on their body as everyone else. The conspiracy theorist old lady explains that the recording humans are present at every major world event and catastrophe, and that they pass pellets that are collected in the sewers to be examined by the aliens, allowing them to experience all 5 senses that the human recording experienced themselves. Marling's character puts this theory out of her mind and manages to finally compose the beautiful song that gets her accepted into the music program in New York. Here, that tagline of the film comes back into play. At this point, Marling feels like she was born for a reason, to go to this music program, something she was destined to do, and that's why she had to suffer, but it was suffering for a greater purpose. However, on the plane, her ticket falls, and we see that she is actually on one of the flights taken over in the 9/11 terror attacks. The tagline thus takes on a new meaning in the final moments. Marling's character suffered in order to write that song, in order to get on that plane, in order to witness the events for the aliens. Her life had a greater purpose to the aliens, but all her suffering was for their benefit, and not for her to compose great music. It is this basic idea that I believe Season 4 will be modeled after, and it is something hinted at within the show. As I keep mentioning, Season 4 will of course be a reflection of Season 2, which had strong alien symbolism. In Episode 4, for instance, the OA puts on a red dress with an alien ship on it. This is to meet the alien-like giant octopus, Old Night. At the end of the season, when the Crestwood Five and the robots complete the movements, OA begins to rise up in the air, almost as if she's being drawn up to some alien ship. The creators have also said that they wanted to reference each season in the pilot. One thing that stood out in particular to many fans was that Prairie's adoptive mother had a theory board that included a strange real-life sighting of UFOs over Michigan, with many fans pointing to this as a potential future season. The abduction phenomena actually has a huge overlap with the reports of NDEs, with many abduction reports even being about their consciousness being taken out of their body by aliens, instead of actually being pulled up into a ship physically. But of course, in addition to the theme of aliens this season, the series as a whole is very spiritual, and even the premise of The Recordist has its conspiracy rooted in ancient mythology, including stories in the Bible and extra-biblical lore. The Recordist was the name chosen for Zal's thesis film because he did not want to give away the big twist by calling Marling's character what she really was, which in mythology is a Watcher. The Watchers are described in the Book of Enoch as being the sons of gods. They were called Watchers as they were said to have come down from heaven to teach the humans about how to farm, form societies, write, and record prophecies in the stars. In the Book of Enoch, they take wives from the daughters of men that create a race of giants. In Esoterica, this is described as being a fall into generation, from which these higher, more enlightened beings shattered their souls and entered the reincarnation line of men that they were sent to carefully guide into a higher state. While trapped in this cycle, they still maintain their duties and seem to have the same instincts. They observe everything on behalf of the higher beings so that the humans can be judged, but along the way they still feel the same instinct to guide humans to raise them to a higher state of being. The idea that the OA is a Watcher was hinted at from the beginning of her story. She is sent to her father to see that he is a good man, and then witnesses a catastrophe, the death of her classmates. Her testimony would prove that her father was a good man, and that bad man killed innocent children. When she returns to Khatun, it's through a puddle that looks like a blue eye. In Season 1, Hap would not record Oe's conversation with Khatun, and instead only heard the rings of Saturn, indicating that the Oe soul traveled to Saturn, in through the eye of Saturn to where Khatun dwells but cannot leave. In Season 2, Nina is seen keeping tapes of all of her dreams. The one Kareem and the OA listen to seems very sexual, describing tongues all over her, but one thing she says turns it from very sexual to very alien. She says, "The tongues are collecting the sweat. They know my body is printing secrets in salt." This I believe to be the process the Dimension 4 aliens use to get the recorded experience off of their watchers, the secrets being the 5 senses printed onto the salt for them to experience in the sweat. Season 4, reflecting Season 2, would likely largely involve a Kareem-style investigation, not into a house, but into the abduction of many people. And like with Season 2, he may find that some people are getting abducted, but only their consciousness is leaving their body, such as with Dimension 2's Michelle. The OA is seemingly sent down to Earth over and over again to observe humans on behalf of Khatun, and is given the choice to go back if she so chooses. But in each case, it's apparent that Khatun can see where her destiny will naturally draw her, to places where she can observe good and evil. It is because of this that Khatun takes away the OA's sight as a child, so that she would not witness the horrors of the whorehouse that she was about to be forced to live in, while still recording everything Khatun would need to see who among the women and clients were there for the wrong reasons, and who was worthy of redemption. It is this desire to come back to her earthly father that ironically cuts her off from him, with her being sent to America. By the time the OA can see her father again, it is after he has apparently died, and she has been hit over the head by Hap, and now she has people she cares about that she wants to return to on Earth. It was the choice of the OA to return to Earth for her father that made her meet these new captives that she couldn't just abandon, cutting her off from her father forever. If the OA had accepted her first death instead of coming back to be with her father, she would have been quickly joined by her father when he died, and they would have spent eternity together in bliss. The story of the OA and the Watchers is also paralleled in Pistis Sophia, a 2nd century Gnostic text about Jesus' cosmic twin, Sophia. In Esoterica, a cosmic twin is called a syzygy, and Jesus is said to be the cosmic twin of Sophia, which is Greek for wisdom. Wisdom is famous throughout many myths as being the firstborn emanation of a greater god who gets sucked into their own physical creation for one reason or another. Sophia as a figure is depicted as someone who doesn't want to abandon humanity and instead is trying to raise humans up to a more spiritual level. Jesus is sent by the first creator god as Sophia's cosmic twin to save her, to teach the truth about Sophia to humans to help her, and help humans ascend, as Sophia herself is just a metaphor for the many spirits of the sons of God trapped in the human reincarnation cycle. Syzygy happens to be the name of the club that the OA performs at, as well as the name of the episode it appears in, the same episode where the OA first meets Kareem. Kareem, of course, is implied to be a cosmic brother to the OA by Old Night, who says that in every dimension, she sends a brother, she being a reference to Khatun, who represents the highest of gods, or to Brit Marling, who sends a brother into the fictional dimensions each season. Thus, in every dimension, Khatun sends a brother, a cosmic twin to the OA, in order to protect her the way Jesus is sent to protect Sophia. Jesus learned this truth when he died on the cross and descended into hell for 3 days, his death really just a metaphor for his life on Earth, Earth being a hell to a higher being like Jesus, coming down to save our souls and take them back up to heaven. The story of the OA, thus, is a figure who is sent to watch over humanity, who became trapped within humanity, and because of how much she cares, keeps coming back to help any human she can, cutting her off from her spiritual father. In Pistis Sophia and really many mythologies, there are considered to be 3 higher dimensions that you can ascend to before coming back to our physical plane with more enlightened knowledge. In Jewish Kabbalah, these 3 higher dimensions are above the physical world, making 4 dimensions total, and 5 dimensions if you imagine a 5th dimension preceding the other 4, or that is all of them combined. Also, in Jewish Kabbalah, we have the concept of tikkun olam, the repairing of the worlds by merging the physical world with the spiritual. All of this follows the pattern of the OA, starting in her physical world, going through 3 higher spiritual dimensions, and then coming to a 5th story preceding all of them that only makes sense with the 4 stories of the 4 seasons combined. Now, the repairing of the worlds is something that is said to coincide with the end of the 6th millennium in Jewish tradition, which we are just 230 years away from about. This is a time many traditions hold to be the ending and starting of a new era. Astrologically, the world is said to be renewed both spiritually and physically on the cross of the zodiac, which the Earth swings through every 6,000 years, with many mythologies pointing to various tragedies that seem to occur cyclically to destroy civilizations as they are building up. At the end of the Recordist, Marling's character couldn't have passed on her pellets to be examined in the sewers after watching the 9/11 event, and it is heavily implied that she will be abducted just before she dies, a phenomenon witnessed by many people around the world at major catastrophes, where strange UFOs seem to take up people who are about to die. Now finally, each season starts and ends the same way. It starts with someone waking up in a hospital-like setting being examined, and it ends with someone chasing a vehicle. That vehicle represents a loved person being taken away from the person chasing it. Now, in seasons 1 and 2, the OA is the one who wakes up in the hospital-like setting, but across the 2 seasons, we actually have 3 vehicles being chased in the finales. The OA story ends with her chasing a vehicle after Hap abandoned her on the side of the road, but in the current timeline, season 1 and 2 both end with Steve chasing an ambulance containing the OA. Up until now, the story had been about the OA needing Steve to help save Homer, and in the end, really save Hap, her shadow, so that they could repair their souls and return properly to Katoon, which in the Dimension 4 narrative would involve them being chosen by aliens to be saved from an oncoming disaster that unworthy humans observed by watchers like the OA would be left behind for. Rumors say that Zal, through social media, revealed that the story of the OA ends with her and the others getting on a spaceship to go to Saturn. While I can't verify if he really said this, it fits all of the other evidence we have so far, with Season 4 of course being the technical end to the story of the OA, and Season 5 looping back to the beginning. However, each season ends with someone left behind, chasing a vehicle, and every season so far is Steve. Steve has grown a lot, but he showed at the end of Season 1 that he likes to sabotage the good things others have done for him, such as when he stabbed the OA in Episode 7. If the OA is a watcher, I believe Steve will be the one person who sabotages himself at the last moment, at his greatest trial, and he will not be chosen to be saved. Instead, just like with the ambulance in Season 1, Steve will chase a ship that is taking away everyone he loves, particularly the OA, while he screams, "Take me with you." So far, the OA is portrayed as being trapped in this loop in order to keep coming back to try and save the captives, but all of that was because she forced Steve into the adventure across the dimensions just for him to be the one left behind. However, we discussed already that in Season 2, Steve was fast enough to catch up to the ambulance holding the OA. This is not because he was physically stronger in Dimension 3, but rather it symbolized his growth. Each season is its own cycle, and by the end of Season 1, Steve wasn't ready to be with the OA. Season 2 was a repeated cycle, and it was enough for him to grow and catch up to the ambulance. Because of that, the OA will realize that if she repeats the entire 5-season cycle one more time, and perhaps does it slightly better herself, Steve will have grown enough that he can actually make it with all of them to the ship at the end of Dimension 4. Katoon has shown that she will let the OA return to Earth as many times as she wants, going back to save whoever is left behind, and thus she would grant her that opportunity one more time, sending the OA back to Dimension 1 to before the events of Season 1 to try and save Steve. Of course, the OA would not go alone. With her, she would bring BB-8, Kareem, Hap, and perhaps many others, perhaps literally everyone. BB-8 is implied to be an angel throughout Season 1, such as when we see her with a halo over her head in her car, or the angel wings behind her in the cafeteria when they perform the movements. However, she never had an NDE, so it was assumed that she can't really be an angel. Without an NDE, this just means that BB-8 would return to the point of her birth, forgetting everything and living an entire life up until she meets the OA, where she has completely forgotten her purpose. This is why the OA tells BB-8 that she forgot her first reason for coming back, which was to help Steve in particular, the boy who needed saving. BB-8 to this point had mostly been invested with her brother Theo, and felt that taking care of him was her purpose in life, and Steve is seen to remind her of her brother Theo. By the end of Season 2, BB-8 realizes that she's been thinking about Theo, thinking Theo was asking to be saved, when really it was Steve in her dreams asking to be saved. This symbolizes how BB-8 wasn't sent here to help Theo, but rather to let him live the life he needed in order to grow, and to help prepare BB-8 so she will be ready to help Steve, so that Steve will remind her of her brother she loves so much, a brother we likely would have had BB-8 meet in Dimensions 2, 3, and 4. Perhaps Theo will even agree to travel back and live the life with BB-8 again, Theo being just another small piece in the puzzle to save Steve. Hap also had no near-death experiences, but was extra sensitive to people who were, noticing the patterns of Oe's violin song and even hearing the sound of a soul leaving a body when working in the ER. This indicates that he's an angel, but like BB-8, has just returned to the moment of his birth. Together, all these characters would return to Dimension 1 to help Steve, but before we would even get to see Steve, Season 5 would reveal to us the true nature of the story that the OA told the Crestwood 5 back in Season 1. The OA had many near-death experiences in Dimension 1 that she could theoretically return to, but there is only one experience that truly makes sense as the starting point for Season 5. As discussed before, each season starts and ends the same way. It starts with the OA waking up in a hospital-like setting after a near-death experience being examined, and each season ends with someone chasing a vehicle. In the OA story, she doesn't start calling herself the OA until the near-death experience she has after she is hit over the head by Hap and given a white dove from Katoon that is supposed to contain the knowledge she needs to help her and the captives escape. The white dove is a symbol of the Holy Spirit and is also present when OA jumps from Dimension 2 to Dimension 3, and is believed to carry the consciousness of the OA from one dimension to the other. This dove Prairie eats is then the version of the OA that has completed her integration across the 4 seasons and is now returning to Dimension 1. When the OA returns from her near-death experience, she wakes up in the bed of Hap with him examining her, similar to how she wakes up in a hospital bed each season with someone so focused on examining her that they don't quite see the human she is in front of them. This is the perfect starting point to Season 5, and where Prairie would start calling herself the OA before realizing she is the OA. From here, we would expect the OA to return to the basement and be excited to see her friends Homer, Scott, and Rachel. However, instead of the beautiful scene where the OA opens her eyes and sees them for the first time, I think the OA will open her eyes and be shocked that in her prison cell there is literally no one there. That is because the other captives, Homer, Scott, and Rachel, were just voices in her head. Before receiving the dove that I believe would turn Prairie into the OA, Prairie already had a lifetime of hearing voices that she believed were real people her father were using to send messages to her. These were suppressed by her meds, but they also numbed Prairie out. When she ran away from home, she would stop taking her meds, and thus the voices would have an opportunity to return. This was something Hap encouraged her to do before allowing her to live with him, writing off her issues as just vivid dreams without the meds. Prairie did touch this version of Hap, this seemingly nice Hap, so we do know some version of Hap is real that acts like this. And in fact, I think this is the most real depiction of Hap there is, with everything else we know about him being a combination of Prairie's delusions, and Hap unfortunately playing along at the wrong moments. I believe Hap was no mad scientist doing unethical experiments, but instead really did study NDE survivors with what little money and resources he could offer subjects, such as the ones he described to Prairie. He did not ask Prairie to come with him, but instead she offered herself up. I believe Hap saw a homeless woman looking for a kind man to help her, and he decided to take a risk and legitimately study her. He would take her home, she would begin to experience withdrawal from years of medication, and the voices would begin to return. It is not until Prairie is alone that the voices start to speak to her. None of the captives shouted or tried to get her attention like they had when they saw that someone was just even outside of Hap's home, such as the sheriff. Scott starts by blaming Prairie for how she ended up there, and Homer cuts him off, telling Prairie not to let her thoughts bring her down, as if Scott is just one of her thoughts with a mean voice. Homer then alludes to how Prairie will cope with her perceived situation, to escape in her dreams. Homer, Scott, and Rachel would be the names she projects onto the voices based off of what little she knows of Hap's other subjects that he described. Experiencing withdrawal from her meds, returning symptoms of her psychosis, and without being able to see, she would think that they are real people. The voices would rationalize that they would be Hap's other subjects, some of which Hap described to Prairie as why else would they be in this basement. The story they built up together would all be about Prairie rationalizing that these voices are real, but that she cannot reach them. These voices would convince OA that they are trapped just like she is in rooms just like hers, all next to each other, but she could never see them and she could never feel them to prove that they were real. Hap I believe to be a very science-minded man, and the scenes that depict him as obsessed with his work are likely very truthful. He has real food in his fridge, but likely eats the nuggets just to not worry about cooking or cleaning for the most part. His life is built around not having any time to interact with anyone, and he only forces himself to sleep so he can wake up refreshed for more work and research. He is already a hermit essentially, and not wanting to cross any boundaries with this blind homeless woman that he gave his spare room to, he wouldn't be sure how to actually help Prairie as she became more psychotic, let alone take her outside as much as she wants or needs for fresh air with all that he has to do. As Prairie starts to lose her sanity from her lack of medication, something Hap encouraged her not to take way back at the restaurant together, he would retreat even further, not sure how to deal with her going crazy, but also feeling the need to study her behavior as part of her experience surviving an NDE. He would start to realize that Prairie was hearing voices and that she thinks they are real people, and he would find reasons to play along. When she first makes sandwiches, for instance, he seems happy to let her eat, but she won't because the others can't. Hap allows her to make them sandwiches, but the way he words it is as if he knows they are imaginary. But he is just trying to encourage her, to play along, to let her have her little crazy moment so that she knows she is accepted in his home. Even the way he talks to the others is as if they aren't real, telling them that it wasn't going to be a regular thing, as if he is really telling Prairie he won't let her make food for her imaginary friends so often, and that they, or rather she, should probably appreciate it. At this point, he wouldn't know that she sees him as their captor, as opposed to them just being other people that live in the basement with her. So each time he thinks he's helping her by playing along with the fact that they exist, he's confirming her delusion that he has imprisoned them. And when a situation becomes dire, Hap realizes that the only way to get Prairie to act rationally is if she thinks she is doing it to keep the others safe, such as when he needs his EpiPen and he claims that they'd starve down there if he died. As Prairie would continue down her spiral, she would become the darkest version of the OA, the one willing to kill Hap by pushing him down the stairs if it means escaping. It is when she is willing to kill Hap that she ends up having her own NDE, which I believe to be Hap legitimately trying to rescue her when he hits her over the head at the cliff. Now, the series can go a lot of ways from there, but I personally imagine that Season 5 will now be the OA back in Dimension 1, living with Hap, realizing that she was crazy. Now that the Haptives are just imaginary people in her head, she would begin to wonder if any of her story was true, or if even Steve himself is just part of her elaborate delusion of traveling dimensions and being stuck in a loop with Hap. She may even continue to play along in her head that they are real, perhaps hearing their voices, but still not seeing her friends in front of her. Hap would spend the season playing along to some degree as well, but trying to show the OA that she is wrong, and the OA wouldn't want to believe it. She'd feel like she's just trapped in Dimension 3 again, with evil Jason Isaacs telling her that she's insane to keep her prisoner, and that somewhere out there her real friends do exist. This would make Season 5 OA the darkest version of herself, yet coexisting in her head with the Season 1 version of herself, the pure and innocent version she believed was being crushed by Hap. Hap, at the same time, is the best version of himself in this reality, not remembering who he is, but only being the nice version of himself because of the great enlightenment OA will give him in the higher dimensions to follow. The idea of the darkest and purest forms of OA and Hap existing in Dimension 1, but also in Prairie's head, takes inspiration from Blavatsky's description of creation, which she describes as being made up of 7 eras that repeat in a continuous cycle. These ages are symbolized by the 7 moving lights in the sky, starting with the Sun, going through Venus, Mercury, the Moon, Mars, Jupiter, and ending with Saturn, the dark end of the Sun, but who will be reborn as the Sun in the beginning of a new cycle, allowing the darkest and lightest extremes to also exist right next to each other in a loop. Across the season, the OA would have driven Hap to his breaking point, having tried to kill him at least twice because of her seeming delusions after he kindly invited her into his home. At the very end of the season, Hap will abandon Prairie after she has done something unforgivable, likely involving the sheriff's wife Evelyn and her death as described by the OA in Season 1. It is presented as Hap's fault, but as the story reverses itself, I imagine Prairie, or perhaps the evil version of Hap that exists inside of her, is the one who ends up shooting the sheriff and his wife. While abandoning her, Hap would be playing the part of the villain one last time, hoping that it will cause her to hide any information that might reveal where he lives or who he is, bringing with her delusional claims that he is a mad scientist who held her prisoner when all he did was give her a free room. At this point, the OA would think she is truly crazy perhaps, but as she wanders, she would make it to the bridge and have a moment extremely similar to that in Season 3. The breaking open moment in Season 3 was the OA realizing that a moment she had written into her show had come true, proving that she really was the OA when that moment came to life with her on the airplane. Here, the OA would look over her shoulder and see the camera recording her from the street. According to the script of the pilot, the OA is looking at us seemingly through the camera, and it is probably because this is the very first moment in the cycle of the story that the OA remembers actually happening after her return from Dimension 4, as it's the first moment to actually happen in the show. Until now, we'd be seeing the reality up to that moment where OA is questioning her sanity, and suddenly she would realize that her friends are real, even if they were only in her head. In Season 3, we learn that Britt Marling can write characters and give them the tools to jump into the bodies of the people who inspired them. And as such, the OA would realize that if she tells her story to the Crestwood 5, it would allow the characters in her head to jump to the bodies of people who look like them in Dimensions 2, 3, and 4, allowing the Evil Hap and the Haptives in Prairie's head to jump to Dimension 2. This would prove that Dimension 1 is the only physical dimension, with Dimension 3 masquerading as the most realistic reality in order to teach the OA that she can make her thoughts into reality in the higher dimensions. All of this makes the OA an intensely complex spiritual work, but I assure you that even if my theories turn out to be 100% correct, I have purposely kept several pieces of information from you, some of which prove my theories even more correct, and others being their own amazing revelations that I believe you should have the opportunity to discover on your own. For those interested in the spiritual works behind the show, please consider subscribing. I will be doing a lot of videos getting into these real-world mythologies and spiritual practices, and along the way, you'll learn even more about what helped inspire the OA. See you guys then.